Are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome everybody. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon. My name is Dixie Zitlow. I'm the Director of Outreach for the Dibble Institute, and I'm very excited about our guest speaker today. I'll introduce you to her in just a moment. We are covering improving young people's lives or young people's outcomes through harm reduction and resiliency work. And Kim has some really great information to share with you today. Next slide, please. If some of you or if anyone has any trouble while they're on the webinar with your audio or something happens, you'll see on the screen here, but this was also in your email, a phone number to call and an access code. So you can follow it on your phone, even if your computer screen is working. And also, you'll notice in your control panel, which is probably on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a questions, polls, and chat. If you have questions during the webinar for Kim or any of us, you can put them in there, and they will get answered either throughout the webinar or we'll have some Q&A at the end. And if we don't get to all the questions, which sometimes happens, we will email you or call you and follow up with you on that. And so next slide, please. Some of you will know who Charlie and Helen Dibble are. This is the gentleman that is the founder of the Dibble Institute. And yes, he's a real person. A lot of people ask us about him and how we came to be. Well, Charlie Dibble was an aeronautical engineer, and in his retirement years, he became very dedicated to working with young people. And in doing this, he became aware that there were some emotional challenges to young people's long-term well-being and their futures and their relationships. And so he started working with a group of people who formed the Dibble Institute. It was originally known as the Dibble Fund. And their goal was to meet the needs of young people in the realm of forming healthy relationships. Next slide, please. People also ask us, so who is the Dibble Institute and what do we do? Well, we're a national and an international organization, and we publish healthy relationship programs for teens and young adults. We are heavily involved in research resources, and besides publishing curriculum, we are also a resource for information, and you can find a lot of that on our website and also in our monthly newsletter. Next slide, please. The Dibble Institute really believes in research. This is very important to us. We equip young people with skills and knowledge that they need to lead healthy romantic relationships now, right now, and in the future. And we do this by translating research into evidence-based teaching tools that are used throughout the country and around the world. Since 2006, close to 2 million young people have been reached by people just like you who are using Dibble programming. Besides publishing curriculum, we are also, as I said before, a resource for research. Next slide, please. We also believe in stable, healthy families and healthy relationships. And we know today that that can look very different. There's no two families that necessarily look alike. Yes, we are pro-marriage and stable relationships. We are definitely anti-violence. We are not against divorce and not against single parents. And we know that it's really hard to engage sometimes with non-custodial parents, but if it's safe, it's worth having a relationship with them especially if there are children involved. Next slide, please. And we also believe that all people should be treated with respect and all have a right to healthy relationships. Finally, we believe that all relationships can be strengthened and enhanced with relationship skill education. This means that we've written our materials not to assume the gender of a young person's partner. We also have included diverse scenarios and role plays throughout our activities and the programs so that you can feel confident that whoever is in your classroom, that they will be treated with respect and learn skills that will enhance their relationships. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce to you Kim Frierson. Many of you that, since I looked at the list of who was on today, our guest today, will recognize her. Kim assists in coordinating the Runaway Homeless Youth Training and Technical Assistance Center, also known as RHYTTAC, in training opportunities, creating and researching content for trainings, and planning the annual RHYTTAC conference, which is coming up in November. Previously, she spent 6 years as a case manager at the YMCA Safe Place Services youth shelter in Louisville, Kentucky. And Kim received her bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Kentucky in 2005. And after a year as an AmeriCorps Vista in 2006, she returned to school and she earned her master's in science and social work from the University of Louisville. And in addition to her role at RHYTTAC, she contracts with the University of Louisville as a facilitator on pregnancy prevention grants funded by the Department of Health and Human Services. And she's spent the last 6 years as a sexual health educator with the university and other local agencies. Kim, we are very pleased that you're with us today. I'm really looking forward to what you have to share with us.
Thanks, Dixie, for that great introduction. It makes me sound important, and that's nice sometimes. But I'm here just to kind of talk about some things as far as harm reduction and resiliency. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming and the work that you do in your communities. I don't think people who do our work get thanked enough because you're probably not thanked monetarily, but understanding that you all are skilled professionals doing something that's really necessary in our community. I take my hat off to you and I appreciate your time. So the objectives we're going to get into today, some of the things we were going to talk about is we're going to review and define harm reduction as a framework. And I'm sure some of us have had harm reduction training. It's not, some of us have, heard this phrase for a while, and it's kind of one of, it is one of those hot topics right now about how we should go about, practicing services. And some people it may be new, so we'll talk about that as well. We'll talk about the benefits and challenges of a harm reduction framework. We'll review the role of resiliency and its importance in changing behavior because, the things that we do, the curriculums that we teach, all of our efforts really kind of speak to that point. And then we're just going to provide some practical tools to improve resiliency in program participants. Next slide, please. So the question for today is, what is the goal of running a program? And when I say program, it could mean, a shelter, your organization, if you are implementing one of Dibble's life skill curriculums, all of those are kind of programs. Like, why do we do the things that we do? What is the goal of having a curriculum? What is the goal of our life skills running programs? And I could probably argue that these three things are kind of what we hope happen. Number one, that we have an impact on youth, that we have impact on their outcomes, short-term and long-term, that we're helping our young people as far as skill building, that they, hopefully we're giving them the tools and teaching them the tools to be successful later on. And I mean, at the end of the day, I think, in many walks of social service life and, youth work and, serving young people, we really want our kids to become self-sufficient, fully functioning adults. That's kind of the name of the game. We want our kids to be, contributing citizens to feel attachment to the community and to feel capable, that they are capable adults, they're able to make decisions, they can take responsibility for themselves, and that they kind of have that confidence to go forward and, you know, have a successful adult life. Next slide, please. And generally, how do we accomplish this? And for the most part, I would say that most of us in our agencies kind of rely on some version of these two things. There's the curriculum, and those are kind of the things that, you know, those assessments, those trainings, those programs that, you know, we use to try to bring our kids along, for them to learn new skills, to kind of become more confident and just kind of be opened up to some education as well. And then there's a relationship, and that is that kind of, you know, exactly what it sounds like, that human relationship, that caring adult relationship that we provide to young folks in our programs. And sometimes maybe we're not as intentional about the relationship piece, but it happens whether we want it to or not. So really kind of breaking those down into the two things that we almost always offer our young people, and the things that we hope help them get to where we want them to be. Next slide, please. So talking about curriculum, because this is a Dibble Institute webinar, I would assume that a lot of us have had some experience either implementing, facilitating curriculums, life skill curriculums, things about healthy relationships, and there's a great precedent for that. I mean, one of the reasons we do that, as we all well know, is that it's evidence and research based. And, you know, knowing that what you're doing works, knowing what you're doing has an impact, knowing that what you're providing your young folks has been tried, has been replicated, is a valid kind of program is huge. Because, you know, we spend, there's nothing kind of more wasteful than providing things or doing things that really don't serve our young folks. So, you know, the importance of an evidence-based and a research-based curriculum is imperative. No, you know, especially these days as funding gets tight and sustainability is a real issue, we have to make sure that the money that we are granted or funded or raised, that we're using it responsibly. And part of that is making sure that we're using curriculums and programs and frameworks that have been proven to work. And then the other thing is structure. You know, most programs, and I know Dibble's curriculums are this way, they give us a structure on how to present life skills, on how to talk about certain issues. That can be huge, having that structure, knowing how to build, you know, on top of a previous conversation. You know, curricula are excellent at doing this. So not only do you see, you know, when you're using a program like that, for example, Love Notes or Mind Matters or what have you, it's research-based, but it also gives you a structure and a way, especially sometimes for our younger workers who maybe don't have a whole lot of experience either facilitating a group or, you know, doing that kind of change work. It gives them a roadmap, and it gives us all a roadmap about how to talk about things, what things are important in the topic that we're talking about, and it just helps us along that way. Next slide, please. And this is actually, I would like to have that first poll question come up. And we're gonna, and I just, and hopefully people didn't cheat and look at the slide, but I really would like to just kind of pose this question to the group. And it's that a therapeutic relationship alone can be a meaningful intervention.
You can just use your mouse and put true or false, and then I'll give you a few seconds, and then I'm going to close out the poll again.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes we get caught up in, you know, we're all beholden to grantors, we're all beholden to funders, and those people want outcomes, and they want numbers, and they want percentages. And sometimes I think that is, you know, part of the game, but also there's this piece about relationship, which is sometimes harder to quantify.
There's your answers there.
Yeah, so about, it looks like about 1 in 5 of us feel like no or false, and then about 80%, 81% say true. Mm-hmm. Okay, we'll move on. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the importance of a relationship. And as you'll see from this slide is these kind of the concepts of relationship and what that can mean for an intervention. This is from a curriculum that the Center for the Study of Study of Social Policy, I apologize, the slide is wrong, have in their curriculum. And the idea is that the relationship that you have with a young person is the most important intervention you will have. My experience has been with anybody who's been working with young folks in an organization or in some other scenario is if you ask that young person, and this is very anecdotal, I don't understand, what you liked about a program, they will usually tell you Miss Dixie or Miss Kathy. Very rarely in my interaction with young people, and they've talked about a positive experience they've had in an organization, very rarely do they say, for example, Safe Place helped me out. They'll say Miss Kim at Safe Place helped me out. They usually identify one person at the very least connected to an agency, but who meant a lot to them, who they had a connection with, that they felt like was a safe adult, that they had a caring adult relationship with. And I think a lot of us are that way. And really this idea that it can be the most important intervention. Now, is it the only intervention? Of course not. But that relationship impacts the impact of your intervention. And, you know, kind of the concept of the better that relationship, the better that caring adult relationship that you have with young folks, that you're either working in a program or delivering a curricula to, the better your all's relationship, the more meaningful that program becomes to them. So even though it is not the end all be all, because number one, as we talked about, it's hard to quantify. Funders really a lot of times are not interested in the, you know, in the quality of the relationship that we have with our young people. It sets the foundation for everything that we provide after that. Everything that we say, any communication that we have is impacted by the nature of the relationship that we have with our young folks. So, you know, I think there is an argument to be made about really getting in there and doing the things to create a safe, dependable, trusting, caring adult relationship with a young person will greatly enhance, number one, that relationship, but anything that you present to them, any life skill, anything that comes after that will be that much more meaningful. Next slide, please. And this is a quote from Urie Bronfenbrenner, earliest 20th century Russian developmental psychologist. And this quote comes from him. Every child needs at least one adult who is irrationally crazy about him or her. And I kind of challenge everyone to kind of think back to your childhood, even teenage years, early adolescence, all the way up through your 20s, that there is probably, you can identify 1 to 2, maybe even 3 adults who you felt like were in your corner. They were your cheerleader. You knew they cared about you. And essentially, on some level, they were kind of crazy about you. They believed in you. They pushed you. They had high expectations for you. Most people, especially people who have the traits that we want our adults to have, to be resilient, to have self-confidence, to feel like they can be successful, have people like this in their lives. They had them in childhood. And the more we can kind of do that for a young person, and sometimes it's not our role to play, but the great thing about young folks, especially adolescents, is they'll choose you, you don't choose them. And when they choose you, they choose you. To really kind of take stock of that and understanding that that type of support, that person who can really kind of believe in that person and challenge them to where they are to go a little further is paramount. Next slide, please. And so, you know, when we're talking about that relationship, and we're talking about the things that we want to give our young people, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about trauma, because, you know, and I saw a preliminary list as far as who is on the webinar. Lots of us, and I might argue almost all of us, come in contact with kids who have had some sort of trauma. I also don't think that there's probably very few people on the phone who haven't had some sort of trauma training. It's almost, you know, mandatory at this point. But as far as the definition, this will be the one that we work out. And it's that, you know, that those events and series of events that create those kind of overwhelming and emotionally harmful and threatening things that have adverse effects that last, that they can't cope with. It's too overwhelming. It's not developmentally correct at that point. And as you know, as the slide says, causes all those things that, you know, physical, social, emotional, spiritual well-being, all of those things are affected. And, you know, this is a SAMHSA definition. I'm sure places you work might have others, but, you know, just for the purposes of, you know, our webinar, this is what we'll work from. Next slide, please. And I'm sure most of us are not a stranger to what kinds of trauma there are. Now, by no means is this an exhaustive list. My work is usually with runaway and homeless youth, and these are the types of things that we see probably the most. And these are all, you know, whether it was secondary or they witnessed this violence, and, you know, witnessing violence is traumatic. Whether you were the recipient of the trauma or the abuse or what have you, being in that situation can cause trauma. So, you know, this isn't rocket science. These aren't, you know, brand new, but really kind of just thinking about all the ways that our young people have probably experienced some sort of trauma, because a lot of our kids have experienced multiple 3, 4, 5s of these types of things. Next slide, please. And for most of us, I would say, have some idea about what is it that trauma, what are the implications of trauma on our young folks. And these are just a few. And these kind of sometimes get in the way of what we're trying to do with our young folks, right? Their self-concept, the perception of control, you know, academic problems, the cognitive skills. The perception of control, I would really like to focus on, because, you know, when we're in program and we're delivering a content, one of the inherent challenges is we're asking you to change your behavior. We're asking you to think a little bit differently about something. And we want you to sometimes go out and practice those skills. If you feel like, you know, your self-concept is down and your perception of control is that I don't have control over anything, it can be a really scary prospect to go try something new. It may seem like utterly incapable. And so really kind of thinking about, you know, the demographics of your kids, what kind of things have gone on in their past, what are the traumatic events, you know, how do they feel about, you know, their self-esteem, their self-worth, their capabilities, all of those things kind of plug into, you know, how well are the things that we're doing, our interventions, whether it be curriculum or relationship, are received. Next slide, please. And especially when we're talking about things like curriculum, these are the things you'll probably see the most. Problem-solving skills, that youth-adult relationship, especially with our young folks who have had inappropriate youth and adult relationships. You will see sometimes that play out. Regulating emotions, you know, kind of flying off the handle or reacting at a 10 when the situation is really a 2. And then just that executive functioning. You know, as we got to remember, especially according to the CDC, adolescence goes up to 25, 26. You know, your brain is still forming. So depending on the age of your kids, and also, you know, the level of trauma they might have experienced, all of this can get in the way of when you try to deliver a curriculum or have programming and want to work on relationship, because it also affects relationship, especially, you know, if they've had an adult who has proven themselves untrustworthy. We all know you have a lot of work uphill to do to kind of create a different path for that. Next slide, please. So this is the result, and I think we've all seen this in session. You know, either difficulty with connecting to the curriculum, maybe just outright kind of avoidance, maybe even being disruptive to the point where they don't have to kind of focus on the curriculum. Little or no willingness to try something different, like, you know, this works for me or it works for my family. And then just having that low confidence and ability to change behavior. So even though your curriculum could be delivered perfectly and you've been working on the relationship and you've modeled that you're reliable and dependable, and that's what I mean when I say relationship, you know, we're the adult professional. So our jobs are to create an environment that's safe, that's dependable, that's trustworthy, and basically, you know, the young person should be able to answer yes to the question of, my worker or the staff or Miss Who so-and-so, I can basically predict how they're going to behave if I do X. It shouldn't be a surprise. You should be able to, in a consistent way, predict your behavior, because that's when you become safe. So all of these things kind of, you know, get in the way of us having the best impact we could have on young folks. Next slide, please. and that's where we get into this idea of harm reduction. And let's talk about what it is first. And it really is, it's a collection of strategies and skills put in place to reduce the harm of risky behaviors. And risky behaviors is the catchphrase. Because what it is it sounds silly to break it down this way, but harm reduction is really that. It's just the reducing of harm. It can be incremental, it can be huge, but what we're focusing on, not so much the behavior itself, but the harm or the consequence that comes with it. And we'll talk about that a little more. It doesn't really require you to cease harmful behavior to receive services that are high quality and compassionate. So, this isn't to say that you have to be, and I don't think people do this really, but someone has to be totally abstinent to come to your program. The harm reduction, that, first of all, that's very far-fetched, and no program operates like that I know, but having those kind of hard, fast lines, like you have to be clean, or you have to, X, Y, and Z before you can receive services. Harm reduction would say they don't have to be clean. Even if they're struggling, even if they're still using, even if they're still, engaging in some risky behavior, I wish they wouldn't. That doesn't mean that they can't access services. And the main goal is to really try to meet kids where they are. This is really for reaching those young folks who may not have been reached on more conventional levels and other methods. So this could be the harder kind of kid to reach. And it also could just be a kid who situationally may feel uncomfortable, we really want to make sure that they feel like they can be successful as well. The one thing, an example sometimes I use is, a lot of young people have experienced trafficking, whether it's sex or labor, but a lot of times sexual health curriculums, some are abstinence focused, but then others really kind of push you to, how do I delay sex? How do I say no to sex? For a lot of those kids, for lack of a better term, those ships have sailed. So when you start talking about, this is your plan, really kind of understanding what you're asking. A kid who's engaging in survival sex, who needs somewhere to stay, when you're asking them to be abstinent, really being aware of what it is that you're asking. So really kind of meeting that our kids are doing the best that they can, that you have to work from the framework. They're doing the best that they can, and they've kind of created some coping skills to kind of deal with their situation. A lot of times it's not what we want at all, but we have to really recognize that that's where they are. But what can we do to reduce the harm that they're putting themselves in by engaging in that behavior? And it's non-judgmental. Of course, we would want, people to be abstinent and be able to have some healthy communication around, sexual issues and that type of thing. My personal preference would be that people at least try to wait until their brain finishes growing before having sex. Now, I know that's not going to happen. So, when a young person approaches me, I have to be non-judgmental, and I have to kind of engage them in services that help them get ready to kind of, address some of the riskier stuff that they're doing. And this is really, a lot of harm reduction is kind of based in the kind of social work, that kind of dignity of all people, that everyone has worth. But it doesn't condemn or condone behavior. It's just kind of like the behavior is what it is, but let's talk about the risks that you're putting yourself in. Next slide, please. This slide can be summed up in the graphic. We are to do no harm. We want to hopefully build confidence. We want to hopefully get people to be motivated by themselves, because we got to admit, we not only should we not be around forever, we won't be around forever. So we need to help them make the best decision and take maximum control over their lives. That is the name of the game. We are not going to re-traumatize anyone. We're going to try to be as empathic and respectful to their situation, because they're the expert on their situation, and give them an opportunity to have a relationship where that's the norm. Because they may not have ever had an adult that said, okay, and, not had a whole lot of judgment, or, quickly goes to solutions, that type of stuff, and tries to quote unquote fix what's ever going on with them. Because that also gives the, the thing that I don't think you're capable of figuring out stuff on your own. It should be a partnership. Next slide, please. So, I talked about what it is, but I think it's also really important to know what it isn't. This is not a replacement for abstinence. In no way are we saying, or am I saying, that you shouldn't strive for abstinence, teach abstinence, highlight abstinence. It's not a replacement for prevention or treatment. It also doesn't encourage use. And when I say use, most of the time when people talk about harm reduction, they talk about it in regards to substance abuse and risky sexual behavior. So we're not saying go out and have all the sex, all the unprotected sex, anytime, anywhere. No one is saying that. No research supports saying anything remotely like that. So it's not this kind of permissive, like, do whatever. That is not what harm reduction is. It's not when someone tells me something that is concerning that I'm just like, oh, okay, and just leave it at that. That is not what's going on. And it's also not kind of a zero tolerance policy, kind of as we talked about. And very lastly, what it definitely isn't is this idea that, you only work with young people who are ready to make changes. You can only work with young people who are motivated. You only can work with young people who want to do the thing. I can count on one hand how many times I've met a kid like that. I have not been in the program where there's a whole bevy of kids who are like, yes, I'm ready to do the stuff. Bring it at me. I'm so motivated. I've never in my life been in a building where there were kids doing that. Now, that does not mean that those kids can't be worked with, that you can't form relationships, and that the curriculum can't be meaningful for them. I don't think that group exists about some of the topics that we try to address. So, this isn't if they're not motivated, this isn't going to work. This is when you bring harm reduction out. And it pairs, really well with motivational interviewing. So, that's what is, when we think about sometimes those harder to reach kids, those kids where it doesn't seem like we can find, their interests or that type of thing, or what motivates them, this is where you come in with harm reduction. Because you may have to start from a very small place that'll seem like a very small thing to you to get them to where, to being in less risky situations and that type of thing. Next slide, please. And really, harm reduction is, change is a process. And this is why it's important. A lot of times, point A to point B probably has 87 steps in between that. So it's not that you are abstinence or everything's terrible, or you use condom every time, or, there's nothing to live for. When you break that process down, number one, there's a lot more wins to celebrate. Of course, I want you to be abstinent, but if you're not using condoms at all, and then you use them twice in a week, that's a win. And you've got to make sure that you celebrate those small successes. That's how you build self-confidence. That's how you build self-concept. That's how they start to feel like, oh, maybe I can do some things. Maybe I can change. I was successful over here. Maybe I can do it in some other area. That is part of what harm reduction is, because any kind of movement in a positive direction, any movement towards the thing that you want to see, please reinforce it. Doesn't mean you have to go to the buffet or, give them $10 or anything like that, even if you just praise them. But don't let those opportunities slip by you. And then, it's easier for youth, but it's also easier for us when we're praising people and we talk about the successes they do have and their ability to change, or the thought that they want to change, or that they want to try to be, a little safer. Those are wins, though. That can really foster the foundation, because that's where it starts, is their willingness to do that. So making sure that we celebrate those things, that is part of harm reduction. It's part of meeting our young folks where they're at, and then we can move them hopefully into less risky behavior. And then, if you change nothing, nothing will change. And that's pretty much true every day. Next slide, please. So this is the easiest way, I think, to kind of think about harm reduction as a continuum. So at the very left, there's that elimination, the abstinence piece. And so I'll use the example of someone who's having survival sex, like where they're staying, the people are demanding they have sex with them so they can stay somewhere. In a perfect world, I would just want to say, don't have sex with them. That's super risky. All of these types of things, and it's unprotected sex at that. That's kind of where, as a worker especially, that's kind of where you go first. Like, don't, please, no. But I also understand that there's a lot of things going on there. I don't know the home situation. At least in their mind, they feel like this is better alternative to going home. So I might not even understand all the dynamics. But how do I make that less harmful? And how do I talk about that isn't just the straight, please don't do that? For example, the piece about having unprotected sex, even inching towards, do you think
Muted.
maybe incorporate condoms into that sex do you think that you can communicate that? Do you think that is less harmful than having unprotected sex? Is it exactly what I want? No, but I have eliminated some harm, so that is less harmful. A lot of our kids are doing some really harmful, highly harmful sexual behavior, having multiple partners in a short amount of time, not using protection in any kind of regularity. Anything I can do to start inching them to the left of this slide is harm reduction. Whether that's they use condoms more consistently, or can you maybe limit or drop one of those sexual partners? And we'll talk about the challenges to harm reduction, because I think sometimes staff will think, well, this sounds real permissive and this sounds not like we're doing enough as far as like getting their behavior under control. And but harm reduction is really about that. It's limiting the harm, it's limiting the consequence, it's limiting that risky thing that's happening. So when thinking about this, of course, we all want our kids to have the safest behavior possible, but knowing, pardon me, that it is a process, that it is a continuum, that they're not just going to jump to having protected sex with one person all the time when they're married, when they've come from some of the places our kids come from, and being realistic about that. So when you think about harm reduction, it is a continuum, and we just want to continually make, hopefully, I don't want to say slide, because this isn't a sliding or deciding thing, but inching them towards that less risky behavior. And eventually, after a while, you can see huge slides and you can reinforce, well, remember you were there and you did this, this, and this, and this, and here you are. So once again, reinforcing that, celebrating the successes, making sure they understand the growth that they have engaged in, because especially kids, and especially at that time, they can sometimes be blind to the things that are going well, and when they have experienced success, and that can be really helpful to them. Next slide, please. So really, especially around sexual decision making, acknowledging that it's a continuum, shifting the focus from the behavior to the harmful consequence. And something to kind of just use in practice is instead of saying don't do blank, really talking about, well, this might happen and what can we do to make that less likely. If you have, don't have instead of saying don't have sex with multiple people, it's like, well, disease spreads a lot, you're probably more likely to get a disease. What can we do to make that less likely? That small shift is really kind of, a practical application of harm reduction at work. Because it's not the straight, please don't do this, but it is I want to make you as safe as I can, so let's start to inch that way. Next slide, please. So really some practice considerations, and these are just a couple of things that I would encourage people to either take to a staff meeting or have the staff do, or just kind of think about. How would a harm reduction philosophy address the following situation? A young person reports engaging in survival sex, and we kind of talked about that, engaging in sex work for drugs or money, or a young person just reports they're in a non-monogamous sexual relationship. All of these are, scenarios that I've come across multiple times, and I'm sure you all have too. So really thinking about how would you address those things in a harm reduction philosophy? What's less, for example, the last one, is it that, can we talk about, multiple partners means more exposure, so can we limit your exposure? Is it possible to, especially if it's more than two people, can it be limited? Can, limit that? Or, what are your motivations for that? I'm just trying to get you not to be maybe so exposed to, different, diseases that might be out there. One way to do that is to limit your sexual partners. Can we talk about what you can do? Do you use condoms consistently with all of them? So I'm not really ever saying, I don't think you should be, exactly in a monogamous relationship. In my mind, of course, that's what I would like. But I also know that with some young people, you have to do the work to get them there. especially when you pull in their trauma experiences and some things that might be getting in the way. So really, it really is about that risk. It's less about the behavior, but the risk that accompanies that behavior. Next slide, please. And so I'm pretty sure by now people have thought about, oh, this isn't going to go over well, or this is going to go over as well as something else we've tried and didn't work, as far as the challenges of really being a harm, operating from a harm reduction framework, or even, and some agencies have done this, writing policies and procedures through a harm reduction framework for their agency. And the first and foremost is, a new way of thinking means change, and people don't like change. They really don't. Most of the time, staff especially don't like change. It can be very difficult. And so, when you start thinking about change, all the anxieties that come with talking about, let's operate from a new kind of perspective, or let's make sure that we're incorporating this into our practice, or how can we make sure when we're delivering the curriculum we're meeting specific needs of kids, that any change is challenging. And the second thing, and I would disagree with this, but I do think that some people think on service this feels very permissive. I think for a long time, youth work and just the, community work, a lot of it is about, there's a control factor, there's a kind of a, not caging, but like our job is to keep people safe, and that is to, control as much as we can about that. So this can feel really, very, very permissive to some folks, especially depending on the kind of staff you have. If they're frontline staff, if they're clinical staff, they probably have a different feel, but it can feel really permissive. And that is not really what harm reduction is for. You're still working towards change. You still want to limit the behavior. You still want to do that, but understanding that sometimes when you come at people, when you come at young folks about what you shouldn't do, that if I would have gone to culinary school if that worked, because telling people what not to do worked, then we could all go do something else. And so sometimes you have to take some of the other tools out of your toolbox as youth workers and use those to get some of the results you would like. It's not a hard and fast success line, and that can be really tricky, especially with funders, because they want hard and fast success lines. So like, when is it a success? Abstinence is a very hard and fast success line. So sometimes there's the kind of some ambiguous, like, how do I know it's success? I would argue you would know when people change their mindset about their willingness to change and starting to talk about change behavior. When they experience some successes, I think that is measurable, but it can be a little kind of a little softer than 95% of kids did not do this thing. The other thing about this is everybody in your agency needs to be on board. All the staff, the receptionist needs to be on board, the youth work needs to be on board, the trainer needs to be on board, the co-trainer needs to be on board, the board of the agency needs to be on board. Everybody has to be of the same mind for this to work. Because that consistency is also part of making our agency and the places that we perform our curricula safe. Next slide, please. So we do all that really to get to this piece of resiliency. And actually, I would like to do the last poll question. We have one other poll question right now that talks about resiliency. And it is this: people are born resilient. What do you think? What do you think? Interesting. So this is a little closer than the other one. So it's almost like 1/3 and 2/3 about being born resilient. And just, so we're all on the same page here, I've thrown up here two real quick definitions of resiliency, but resiliency really is that kind of bounce back. Like when something traumatic happens, that you're able to manage it, and kind of, bounce back from that thing and kind of learn and kind of move on. And for the most part, research shows that now that some level of resiliency people are born with, but it is something that can be learned, and it is something that can be supported. And so let's talk about that. Next slide, please. You know, one of the things, and this goes into the stuff we want to make sure our kids have, is this is what you see from resilient people. This is what you see from resilient youth, that they are able to face challenges, they're making productive decisions, and I mean, especially in sexual health, being able to make productive decisions is, you know, the skill we wish everybody walked in with. Thinking about the results of their actions and taking responsibility for them. And then just kind of the positive influence on their development and well-being. So you don't usually see, you know, it's a protective factor. So sometimes emotional and physical delays are not so traumatic or, you know, aggressive when kids are resilient, when adults are resilient. So when you think about all the things that resilience is, that ability to bounce back, that ability to kind of manage, and what it gives you about feeling like a capable person, harm reduction is kind of the means to hopefully the resiliency end. Because if we meet kids where they are and we celebrate their successes, this hopefully all comes to a place where they have felt success, they've been reinforced that they have been successful, that when they limit their risk, even though it is not the end goal, but they, you know, celebrate those highlights on the way, that they have, for lack of a better term, more wins under their belt. That's when you start to see kids who feel like change is possible, that they can change their sexual behavior if they wanted to. It's not this scary thing where they might fail and they feel like they don't have the tools, or, you know, it's not within their control. Those are the types of things we want to kind of combat against. And so when we are doing harm reduction work, we are also building resiliency. And that is, you know, the key thing with building capable adults. Next slide, please. So really, when you're thinking about it, you know, these things, highlight past ways they've exhibited resilience. If you've seen it, call it out. As I said, I cannot say this enough. Celebrate those small successes, and then build confidence and competence. Because, you know, especially, you know, kids who may have experienced, who have sometimes maybe not made the best sexual decision, they can feel kind of discouraged. But there have been times where they probably have had some sort of resilience, where they've bounced back, where they did make a good decision. And highlighting that and knowing, you know, even the smallest thing being like, you know, it seems like you have a lot of, you don't feel like you can do this, but I've seen you, or you've talked about, you know, a time where you did kind of make a good decision. If you're capable there, you're capable over here too. And reminding them of that. That, you know, and what about that situation from the other kind of, you know, helped you become successful? Well, let's take that to what we're talking about now. All of those things, reminding them that they are capable and that they are able to kind of make good decisions from time to time, will strengthen the idea that they can make them most of the time, and kind of help them move forward. Next slide, please. Because the end goal is this: we want to make our programs and curricula meaningful and impactful. That's the whole name of the game. Nobody wants to do things that don't work. It's not, you know, fiscally or community or just responsible in any way. And pardon me, building self-sufficiency and self-efficacy in our youth and our young people, giving them the tools to go out there and be capable and get jobs and maintain jobs and manage conflict and communicate effectively with a partner, and, you know, look for the warning signs that things are not, you know, maybe be leaning towards abusive, and just having negotiation skills, especially in physical and romantic relationships. That's what we're looking for. So part of the thing we want to do is make sure that we are creating low barrier programs, that kids who, you know, may have stumbled in the past don't feel alienated. That's also one of the reasons, you know, we do what we do, and hopefully kind of think about harm reduction in that way. We want to make sure that they feel welcome. We want to make sure that just because, you know, and sometimes, you know, our kids have kind of warped ideas about things, like it's not uncommon for a trafficking victim to feel like that's their fault. If they come in thinking that, they may be like, well, that I've done so much stuff that I can't even go to this. We want to make sure as much as we can to create low barrier things, even if they've made some mistakes, even if they've experienced a pregnancy, even if they've had a disease, that you can improve your relationship skills. You can improve your negotiation skills. You can improve the communication you have with an intimate partner. That no matter what your past experience is, you can do that. So making sure that our programs aren't limiting people or giving off the impression that if you kind of messed up, that this isn't for you. And then, I mean, really aiding creating successful young adults. We want all of our young adults to be successful. We want them to be successful in their relationships, but we also want them to be successful in life. And the hope is that, you know, hopefully working from a harm reduction lens, building their resiliency, reminding, you know, keeping in mind their trauma. So when you think about how they'll operate in program, operate in, you know, in lessons, and what you can focus on as far as wins and successes, all of that hopefully will help create our successful young adults. So when they leave our programs and they've completed the curriculum and they've graduated, and we've given them as much as we can as far as skills and knowledge and all that type of stuff, that they feel capable to use it, that they feel like they have control over their lives, that they can negotiate, that they have the self-esteem that if I want to make a change later, I can, but that they feel like all of those things are kind of in their tool belt. And that's really what we're trying to do with our young folks, no matter what programs we're in and what kind of curriculum we're delivering. So next slide, I believe that's it. I want to take a moment to recognize
Unmuted.
Teresa Rimmert. She's the Director of Program Development at the Center for Combating Human Trafficking. It's through Wichita State University. She is very agreeable, and she is also an excellent trainer and very knowledgeable about a great many things. So I have put her email up here if you have specific questions about those types of things. She is more than happy to answer your questions. And then my information, I am Kim. I'm the training specialist at RHYTTAC, which is operated by the National Safe Place Network. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, complaints, please do not hesitate to let me know that. I appreciate all of your all's time. I thank you for all the work you do in your community, because that is huge, and you get, you know, that's a day in, day out job, and you all are professionals, and I appreciate your time. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kim. We really appreciate you sharing both your expertise and also sharing the name of your colleague that you've worked with to be able to do this. We had a comment come through that I wanted to share, and if maybe we can each speak to this or both speak to this. The comment was, I would, here's what this, I believe it was a gentleman said, I would say also consider that monogamous relationships is not their preferred type of relationship. It's important to be aware of open relationships and polyamorous relationships. So do you have anything you want to say to that comment?
Yes, and I think that's an excellent point, because what we want to make sure that we're doing is not the nature of the relationship isn't the issue. It's that sometimes when you have multiple partners, you're more at risk for some, you know, the more partners you have, the more at risk you are at disease. So the issue in a harm reduction framework, what you would focus on is, what are you doing to be safe with with whoever your partners are? Because you're absolutely right. If polyamory is kind of, you know, what they're doing, then it's not the polyamory. That's not the thing we want to focus on. It's the risks that sometimes come with having multiple partners. So that conversation from a harm reduction framework, number one, we're trying to be no judgment, and we're about risk. We are about risk because, you know, it's kind of like, you know, making sure that we are creating them to be more safe. And so it's not about, a lot of times it's not about, I don't want to say the nature of the thing, it's about the consequences that may come from that thing. So you're whoever it was, I think you're absolutely right. You wouldn't, you know, polyamory is not the issue. It's how can we limit the risk that comes with polyamory? How can I make you as safe as possible in the situation that you find yourself in?
Right, good. And from a Dibble standpoint on that, we've had this comment and put in a question form come up in some of our trainings. Well, what about young people who are in polyamorous and or open relationships? What do you say about relationship education to them? And it's quite interesting because, again, just like you said, it isn't that, it's also being deliberate. is it that I'm in a polyamorous relationship because I just ended up there and I've not made a choice about anything and I'm not thinking about risk? So I think coming at this both as in a health and also a heart framework using harm reduction can really help them to consider what type of relationship they're in, one, so they can make safe choices, and two, is that what they want, or do they just find themselves there? This is all a part of that maturing and making deliberate decisions about empowering them to make deliberate decisions, really.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree, I agree with you, Dixie, and I would even go so far as to say that that's part of the continuum. I think the first piece of the continuum kind of on the right side is that let's make sure you're safe with your partners. And once you do, because you got to do the relationship building, especially if you're going to kind of check in with the, the heart piece that Dixie talked about. When you talk about, okay, I'm trying to make sure you're safe. Number one, you're exhibiting the non-judgmental and all that type of stuff. That helps you build the relationship to be able to hopefully down the road start to do some of that change work, because harm reduction on some level, I don't want to say it's ground level, but it kind of is. You're getting in there and you're proving yourself to be kind of, that kind of unconditional positive regard, if you will. When you build that relationship and you can do something, and that's a whole nother training, to be all the way honest, then you can start to do that work about that change work about, I'm just kind of checking in now that we kind of know each other and we kind of understand how we each communicate about, is this a relationship you want? Is it okay? If it's not, okay, we can talk about that too. But that you got to start with that risk. You got to start sometimes there to do that, because we all know when people who we don't really have a good relationship with come and try to tell us something, how does that generally go? So, making sure that you've done that work to kind of do the things that Dixie is talking about, which most of us are pretty, hopefully do a pretty good job of, but just kind of, especially for some kind of harder to reach kids or kids who have, a lot of behaviors, or putting themselves in a lot of risk, you might have to start with, starting with the risk part.
Absolutely. We got a comment from Demetrius Stone in California, and he says, agreed, as Kim says, as long as we aren't focusing on the relationship itself, but its risks, both physical and emotional, that we want to make sure that they're aware of. And I think that just reinforces what you've said about using this, an advantage of using a harm reduction approach in building a relationship with them. Please feel free to type in any questions you have or comments. As I've said, we either get to you this afternoon or we will answer you privately. Kathy, because I have no more questions coming up right here, would you like to share with us what's coming up next in our webinars?
Sure, and I'll just go through these few slides briefly. I did record the webinar, so the webinar and the PDF of the webinar will be available on our website in about 3 business days. By Monday afternoon, I would say that I'll have all that up for you. So you would just look under archived or current webinars to get that information. Also, you can keep in touch with us by subscribing to our newsletter. If you go to our website, you can see a link that says subscribe here. You can like us on Facebook, and we are on LinkedIn as well. And October 11th, we're going to be having a webinar with these 2 gentlemen from Harvard University. They have done a paper called The Talk. So if you'd go to our website at dibbleinstitute.org, you can go to current webinars and you can register for that free webinar then. It's very exciting. We've got a bunch of people already signed up, and we've only had 1 announcement go out. So we're very excited about that. I think that's it.
Great. Again, thank you, Kim, and thank you, Kathy. Anytime you would like to talk to either Kathy or I about how any of our curricula use the harm reduction approach, we'd be happy to talk with you about that. Check out our website, sign up for email lists so that you're always up about what's happening here in Dibble Land. And follow us on Facebook. I always love to hear from you. If there's not anything else, I want to wish everybody a happy afternoon and enjoy the rest of your day.
Great. Thank you, Dixie.
Mm-hmm.